They didn't just steal our oil, they erased our names from the story. Before Texas struck black gold, Africa was already dripping in it. They won't teach you this in school. They'd rather show you cowboy hats and Texas sunsets than black engineers in dusty African heat testing, crude between their fingers, smelling the future. They want you to believe oil history starts with some white man yelling, "Eureka!" on stolen land. But long before that, African soil was already leaking secrets. Black hands were already mapping underground rivers of power, and black minds were already calculating empires. They buried our barons. They buried our blueprints. They buried our bragging rights. You've heard of Rockefeller. You've heard of Getty. You've heard of Shell, BP, Exxon, but you've never heard of the black oil kings who walked the Niger Delta before it was a crime scene, who studied the ground like scripture, who knew where the earth hid her darkest honey. They scrubbed them out of the headlines, out of the textbooks, out of your imagination. Because if you knew Africa struck oil first, if you knew black men and women once stood at the center of the world's most powerful resource, you'd start asking dangerous questions. Who owned the first wells? Who signed the first contracts? Who got paid and who got played? This isn't just about oil. This is about memory, about how an entire continent can be rich in resources but poor in recognition. They turned our barons into locals, our pioneers into labor, our visionaries into villagers. And then they told you, Africa is late to the game. No, Africa was the game, the board, the pieces, and the prize, so sit tight. In this story, we're digging up more than crude. We're digging up names, faces, and forgotten empires. They thought they buried the black oil barons. We're here to exhume the truth. Before Europe even knew what to do with the dark gold, Africa was already bathing in it. Long before Texas had a cowboy, the Niger Delta had kings whose feet rested on rivers of crude. They don't tell you that part. They skip that chapter. They fast forward the movie to when the West arrives, like Africa was just sitting there waiting for a savior. No, Africa was the opening scene, the first act, the pilot episode they lost in the archives. Picture it. While Europe was still choking on coal dust and candle smoke, African hands were already slick with oil seeps bubbling from the ground. Not accidents, not miracles, knowledge, passed down like family recipes, mapped in stories, songs, and sacred ground. Europe met oil with paperwork, contracts, concessions, charters, and crowns. Africa met oil with memory. This land bleeds black. This river shines at dusk. This ground is not just soil, it's a treasury. But when Europe finally smelled the crude, they came dressed like opportunity and moved like a heist. They showed up with flags and Bibles, talking civilization, with one hand on the cross and the other hand on the land deed. They called it exploration, like Africans were blind in their own backyard. Let's be clear, you don't build empires off a rumor. You don't redraw a whole continent for fun. They carved up Africa and Berlin because they knew what lay beneath the soil. Rubber, gold, copper, and that thick black blood the world now runs on. Europe turned oil into an industry. Africa already knew it as inheritance. In Europe, oil made tycoons. In Africa, oil made targets. In Europe, they put their oil men on magazine covers, called them captains of industry, pioneers, visionaries. In Africa, they erased ours from the record, called them tribal leaders, locals, natives, anything but what they really were. Resource strategists, land economists, energy barons before the word petroleum ever touched a European tongue. They want you to believe Africa only entered the chat after Shell, BP, Total showed up with shiny rigs and logos. But the soil tells a different story. Old maps, old travelogues, even their own dusty archives whisper about bitumen lakes, oil springs, tar pits in lands they labeled uncivilized. How is the land smart enough to have oil, but the people on it are supposed to be stupid? Make that math make sense. Europe turned oil into infrastructure, refineries, pipelines, shipping lanes. Africa turned oil into survival, medicine, waterproofing, sealing boats, fuel for fire, light in the dark. Different languages, same genius. But here's the trick. Once Europe realized Africa struck oil first, they didn't clap. They didn't partner. They buried the evidence and rewrote the script. They called their wells discoveries and our wells superstition. Their extraction development and our ownership obstruction. They walked into oil-rich kingdoms, looked at rulers who understood the land better than any geologist, and said, "Sign here. Ink on paper, gun on table, ship at the shore." From that moment on, the story of oil stopped being African and started being international. That's code for, we took it, and now it belongs to everybody but you. Understand this, Africa was not late to the oil game. Africa was the game, the board, the prize. Europe built fortunes, Africa paid the price. They built London, Paris, Rotterdam off fuel that flowed from black earth, while the villages sitting on top of that same oil were left with poisoned rivers and promises that expired. They got stock exchanges, we got stability operations, they got billionaires, we got peacekeeping missions, they got legacies, we got our names scrubbed out the credits. But history has a leak. Truth seeps. No matter how deep they bury it, oil rises, so does memory. Those early African oil barons, the chiefs who controlled the creeks, the merchants who knew which land sweated black, the rulers who taxed every drop that left their shores, they didn't vanish, they were erased. And when you realize that, you stop asking, why is Africa poor? And start asking, who got rich off Africa's first oil? Europe walked into the story late and wrote themselves as the main character. Africa opened the book. Now we're here, flipping the pages back, reading the lines they tried to cross out, calling the roll on the black oil barons they thought were gone. They're not gone. They're waiting in the footnotes. We're about to drag them back to the headline. Europe loves to brag like it invented everything: steam, steel, science. They roll out those black and white photos of men in funny hats, point at a rig in Texas or some cold field in Russia and say, "Here, this is where oil history begins." Lie. By the time Europe even realized oil was more than lamp juice, Africa had already been whispering to the ground, already listening to the earth's heartbeat through the soles of bare feet. See, Europe never measures. Africa remembers. Europe had maps. Africa had memory. Europe had charts. Africa had stories. Europe had ownership papers. Africa had the land itself. Before they called it black gold, our people just called it what it was: the earth sweating, the ground crying thick tears, the soil bleeding a dark river. In what they now call Nigeria, long before a British flag ever pretended to own that sky, villagers knew places where the ground oozed, thick, slow. Children were warned not to play there. Fires burned longer when that strange liquid touched the flame. But we didn't bottle it. We didn't build empires off it. We didn't turn it into a god because Europe saw fuel. Africa saw a warning. Europe said, "How do we extract this?" Africa said, "How do we respect this?" But when the ships came, they weren't just hunting bodies anymore. They were hunting the future. They saw that dark shine in the soil and smelled tomorrow's power. Understand this. When they carved up the continent with rulers and lies, they weren't just stealing land. They were staking claims on oil they hadn't even drilled yet. They drew borders around secrets our ancestors already knew. They told the world Africa was late to the oil game. Meanwhile, African fishermen were already skimming slicks off the water. African healers were already mixing that black liquid into remedies. African traders were already bartering strange, flammable earth juice long before some European expert gave it a Latin name. Europe writes, "Oil was discovered in Africa in 19-something by Sir So-and-so. Africa knows oil wasn't discovered. It was noticed by a stranger. It was reported by a thief. It was monetized by a guest who refused to leave. They tell the story like Africa was the stage, Europe the actor, America the director. No, Africa was the writer. Africa was the script. Africa was the first scene they tried to cut from the movie. They show you pictures of white men in helmets standing on rigs in the Niger Delta, pose like they brought the future to a dark continent. But the truth? They were late to a party our people didn't even want to throw. They came with drills. We already had wells. They came with ledgers. We already had roots. They came with contracts. We already had understandings. Europe industrialized oil. Africa recognized shit. Europe said, we found oil in Africa. Say it right. Europe found oil that Africans had already found, already named, already navigated around. But here's the trick. If they admit we were first to the oil, they have to admit we were first to the value. If they admit we were first to the value, they have to admit they built their wealth on resources they did not own, from lands they did not respect, over people they tried to erase and bury. So they wrote us out, turned our knowledge into legend, their theft into discovery, their invasion into development. Europe says, we brought progress. Africa answers, you brought pipelines to rivers that already fed empires. You brought flares to skies that already held galaxies. You brought profit to a place that already knew abundance. They want you to think Africa just stumbled into oil like we were blessed by accident. No. Africa was sitting on the throne of energy long before Europe learned how to spell petroleum. And the black oil barons, the real ones, the early ones, the ones who traded, organized, moved, and understood this dark river before any European company had a logo. We're about to call them by name. We're about to pull them out of the margins. Because history didn't start in Europe and oil didn't either. They lit their cities with what they took from our soil. Now we're about to light the truth with what they tried to bury. They keep saying oil built Europe. Oil made America. Nah, oil funded their lies. Oil fueled their amnesia. Because before they had skyscrapers kissing the clouds, we had kingdoms counting constellations. Before London had street lamps, we had caravans crossing the Sahara, slick with black gold and desert dust, trading in a language older than their alphabet. They talk like we were barefoot in the dark while they discovered the world. But the only thing they discovered was how to write themselves as the main character in a story they stole from our library. They call them oil tycoons. We called them uncles, aunties, elders, those quiet black barons who knew where the earth bled riches long before some pale-faced explorer showed up with a map and a Bible. In Europe, they had lords and dukes signing papers in candlelight, arguing over borders they drew with trembling hands. In Africa, we had elders and traders counting barrels in their head, reading the soil like scripture, smelling profit in the wind before a single drill kissed the ground. In Europe, they worshipped the stock exchange. In Africa, we respected the land as an inheritance. They saw oil as a weapon. We saw it as a well. But here's how the trick worked. They showed up with flags and fake smiles, called our barons tribal chiefs, called our contracts treaties, then wrote them in a language designed to rob us. They put suits on pirates and called them companies. They put medals on thieves and called them governors. They erased our oil barons and crowned their own. In Europe, they built museums to celebrate their plunder. In Africa, we buried our brilliance in unmarked graves, forced to act like we were late to a party we actually hosted. Understand this. When their factories roared, it was our oil that screamed. When their war machines rolled, it was our wells that wept. Their industrial revolution was our interrupted evolution. They want you to think we were just sitting here, waiting to be developed. But Africa was not waiting. Africa was working. Africa was trading, Africa was counting, Africa was calculating. Our black oil barons moved in silence because when you glow too bright in a world built on theft, they don't just dim your light, they bury the whole story. Europe wrote itself as the genius, Africa as the backdrop. They painted themselves as the architects, us as the scaffolding. But the truth? They were the ones scrambling in the dark, chasing whales for lamp oil, while our soil sat on a sea of fire they didn't even know how to name yet. So when they say, oil powered our progress, hear the missing line. Our progress was powered by what we took from you. They lit their streets with stolen light. They built their empires on buried black signatures. And every time they signed a deal, another African baron disappeared from the record. But paper burns. Truth doesn't. And now that the smoke is clearing, we're about to call those barons by name, drag their stories out of the shadows, and show the world that Africa didn't just join the oil game. Africa started it. Next, we talk receipts, names, nations, wells, the buried blueprints of a black petropower they prayed you'd never see. But let's rewind this film back before Europe even knew what an engine was, before a single white hand ever twisted a steel valve. Africa was already leaking light from the ground, before Texas had a cowboy, before Saudi had a skyline, before London smelled like gasoline and ambition. This soil was sweating crude. Black rivers under black feet. They taught you Europe discovered energy. Lie. Europe discovered theft. Africa discovered survival. In the Delta, in the Gulf of Guinea, long before some pale surveyor showed up with a map and a smirk, our people watched the earth bubble strange, waters that burned, sands that stained. They didn't call it oil reserves. They called it, this land is alive. Europe saw that same miracle and called it property, concession, resource, code words for take it, strip it, ship it. Understand the contrast. Europe had wood and hunger. Africa had forests, rivers, and patience. Europe had cold winters and empty cupboards. Africa had sun, 12 months, and soil that forgave mistakes. Europe ran out of trees, ran out of land, ran out of time. So they sailed south, eyes wide, pockets empty, and bumped into a continent sitting on a liquid throne. They came from coal smoke and soot choking on their own progress, and found African fire just seeping from the ground. No factories, no smokestacks, just quiet power humming under village feet. Picture it. Europe, layered in wool, coughing in the fog, burning rocks to keep warm, dreaming of machines they couldn't yet feed. Africa, bare feet in hot sand, cooking with palm oil, shea, groundnut, bathing in rivers that whispered old stories, walking over oil fields like it was just another Tuesday. They turned our normal into their miracle. When Europe finally caught up to the idea of engines and empires, they came back with new language, exploration, development, modernization, translation. Where's the black gold, and who do we have to bury to own it? Because understand this, Africa didn't just have oil. Africa had first oil. When they were still guessing what ran the sun, our land was already hiding a darker star beneath the crust. But here's the trick. They couldn't let the world know that. If Africa was first, then Africa is central. If Africa is central, Europe is not the hero. If Europe is not the hero, the whole movie falls apart. So they edited the script. They cut out the black engineers who never got titles, the local minds who knew where the earth bled, the elders who could point to a swamp and say, "There, dig there, the ground is flammable." They buried those names like toxic waste. In the school books, they start the story in Pennsylvania. In the lectures, they start in Baku. In the boardrooms, they start in London and The Hague. But the earth doesn't lie. Seismic lines don't bow to colonial timelines. Africa was humming long before Europe learned the tune. Europe came with compasses and contracts. Africa already had coordinates in the bones of her people. Europe came with rifles and refineries. Africa had memory, stories of burning waters and cursed ponds that were never curses at all, just crude, waiting for a name. You see the pattern? Europe, no oil, big guns, big hunger. Africa, oil, no guns, big heart. Guess who wrote the history? They painted Europe as the genius, the brave explorer, the oil whisperer. Africa? They cast us as the background, extras in our own movie, standing in the frame while they drilled under our shadows. But the truth is simple. The first real petro-kingdoms weren't in marble halls. They were in mud huts above million-barrel dreams. They were in river villages sitting on oceans of leverage. And that's why they had to erase the black oil barons before you met them. Because once you realize Africa struck oil first, you start asking dangerous questions. If we had the fuel, who powered whose empire? If we had the wells, who really owned the 20th century? If we had the crude, why are we still begging at the pump? Hold those questions. We're not done. Next, we are naming names, tracking the ghost billionaires they buried, and the deals signed in languages your grandparents never spoke, but your land is still paying for. Let's talk ghosts with oil on their hands, not the ones they show you in history books, the ones they edited out. They told you the story started in Texas. Rockefeller, Standard Oil, white men in black hats standing on black gold. They framed it like, then Europe discovered oil, then the world changed. Lie. Remix. Propaganda with a suit on. Africa struck first, not by accident, by design of the soil, by the patience of the earth. But listen to how they play it. In Europe, when oil shows up, they call it innovation, industrial revolution, birth of modern wealth. In Africa, when oil shows up, they call it instability, resource curse, corruption. Same liquid, same century, different headlines. See the trick? They teach you about Rockefeller, but never about the black oil barons they erased from the script. Men and women who knew the land, knew the wells, knew the routes before the maps were even printed. They didn't stumble onto oil. They pointed and said, drill there, that's where the earth is humming. But history got edited in London, not Lagos, in Paris, not Port Harcourt, in Brussels, not Bonny. So the story goes like this. In Europe, contracts were written in their own tongue, inked in daylight, signed with their names in big, proud letters. In Africa, contracts were whispered in back rooms, translated through 3 middlemen, signed with an X by a chief who spoke 6 African languages, but not a word of the one on the paper. They walked into villages with flags and Bibles, left with signatures and land rights. They smiled for the photos and buried the people who actually owned the ground. Let's name the pattern, even if they buried the names. There were black men who owned refineries in the making, black traders who moved palm oil before crude oil even hit the headlines, black shipping magnates who knew every port from Luanda to Liverpool. They were on the verge of becoming what Rockefeller became, oil royalty, pipeline kings, shipping emperors. But Europe had other plans. In Europe, competition became market rivalry. In Africa, competition became rebellion that needed to be pacified. In Europe, a business rival gets sued. In Africa, a business rival gets erased, labeled insurgent, hostile, obstacle to development. You see the contrast? Same ambition, different punishment. They buried black barons in footnotes, turned their grandchildren into tenants on land that once bowed to their family name. Your great-grandfather might have been one deal away from owning the well, owning the rigs, owning the ships. Instead, he watched a foreign flag rise over his own shoreline, watched strangers count his soil in barrels, watched his river get a new name in a language he'd never heard. They call it European expansion. We call it what it was, a quiet robbery done in broad daylight. Look at the difference. In Europe, oil money built universities, banks, opera houses, gleaming capitals. In Africa, oil money built palaces for puppets, military bases for stability, and offshore accounts with no return address. In Europe, oil tycoons got statues. In Africa, oil witnesses got silence. They make you think Africa was late to the party when Africa was the house, the music, the generator in the back keeping the lights on. They just didn't put your name on the deed. Those ghost billionaires I mentioned, they're not ghosts because they were myths. They're ghosts because they were erased. Erased in coups, erased in accidents, erased in riots that appeared right after someone refused to sign their land away. In Europe, a contract dispute ends in court. In Africa, a contract dispute ends in a crater, a missing plane, a village burned by unknown gunmen. Unknown to who? Not to the oil. Oil knows exactly who it serves. And those deals, those cursed papers written in languages your grandparents never spoke, they're still ticking. French on the page, blood in the pipeline, English in the clause, tears in the delta, Portuguese in the margins, silence in the village. Your land is still paying for signatures signed by men who couldn't even read the trap they were walking into. Europe writes concession. Africa lives possession. Europe says long-term partnership. Africa feels long-term handcuffs. They tell you your leaders were corrupt. Some were, some weren't. But understand the game. In Europe, corruption is a scandal. In Africa, corruption is a tool, a lever, a reason to step in, take over, rewrite the rules, and walk out with the oil rights tucked neatly in a briefcase. So when they say Africa just didn't manage its resources well, hear the translation. We made sure the right Africans never got the chance because a black oil baron rooted in his own land, answering to his own people, speaking his own language, building his own navy, his own banks, his own refineries. That man, that woman, that family, that's a threat, not to Africa, to Europe, to the myth of European genius, to the story that says they were advanced, we were behind. Behind where? On whose clock? On whose calendar of progress? Understand this. Africa didn't just have oil. Africa had timing. Africa had leverage. Africa had people ready to play big. They just never tell you about them because if they did, you'd look at yourself differently. You'd stop seeing yourself as the latecomer, the charity case, the country forever developing. You'd realize you come from a line of almost barons, almost tycoons, almost empires that were cut short on purpose, not by fate, by policy, by paperwork, by rifles standing behind translators. So remember this contrast. In Europe, oil history is a highlight reel. In Africa, oil history is a crime scene, but crime scenes can be revisited. Evidence can be reopened. Names can be unburied. And that's where we're going next. Into the files, into the archives, into the stories your grandfather started, then went quiet about. Stay with me. We're not just telling history. We're dragging it back into the light, barrel by barrel, name by name, deal by dirty deal. See, they trained you to think oil history starts with some Texas cowboy hat tipped low, strutting across a dusty field while the stars and stripes flaps behind him in slow motion. Hollywood told you white man drills, black gold spills, world changes, roll credits. But let's rewind that reel. Because before Texas, before Saudi, before these billion-dollar oil families started writing checks with your future, Africa had already struck oil. Not by accident, not by luck, by design, by geography, by God's own layout. Let me draw the split screen for you. On the left, Europe. Fog, factories, chimneys coughing up smoke, coal dust in the lungs, soot on the windows, streets choked with horse manure and hunger. They burned rock to make steam, burned forests to make fire, burned men to make empires. On the right, Africa. Coastlines dripping with crude, swamps whispering with gas, land so rich it sweats resources. oil seeping from the ground before anyone had a word for barrel, flames dancing from the earth like the soil itself was praying in tongues. But here's the trick. When Europe looked at Africa, they didn't see partners. They saw a fuel station, a warehouse, a vault with no alarm system. They told you Africa was late to the oil game. Nah, Africa was the game. The field, the ball, the scoreboard, and the stadium lights. The ones who came late were the ones who arrived with flags and Bibles, maps and rifles, contracts and poison ink. They didn't discover oil. They discovered how to rename on ownership. Your land signed over to their company. Your river rebranded as a concession. Your ancestors' ground turned into Block 17, Block 34 offshore license. Let's talk contrast. Europe, no oil, but ships, guns, banks, printing presses, propaganda machines. Africa, oil, gold, copper, diamonds. But no navy to guard it, no media to spin it, no global court to defend it. So what happens when the empty hand meets the full table? The empty hand smiles, says civilization, says development, says we're here to help, then flips the table, grabs the plate, and tells the world you never knew how to cook. They wrote books calling Africa resource rich but poor. Like that's a mystery. That's not a mystery. That's a crime scene. Oil in the Niger Delta before Shell set foot. Flames in the ground, locals calling it fire that never dies. They used it to light, to cook, to seal, boats, to trade. But when the Europeans showed up, suddenly it wasn't our oil anymore. It was their field, their production, their discovery. Discovery? You can't discover what people already live on. That's not discovery. That's rebranding with violence. And the men who knew this, the Africans who stood up and said, hold up, this is ours, they got erased. Not always with bullets. Sometimes with contracts, sometimes with coups, sometimes with silence. Europe builds statues for their oil barons, names on towers, foundations, universities, philanthropy, tours with crocodile smiles. Africa? Our oil barons got buried in footnotes, if they got mentioned at all. They buried the chiefs who refused to sign. They erased the lawyers who pushed back. They sidelined the ministers who said, not on my land, not like this. Because if you knew the truth that Africa struck oil first, that Africa's ground financed Europe's skyscrapers, that African crude greased the gears of their industrial revolution, you might start asking for back pay with interest. So they tell the story like this. Europe, smart, innovative, forward-thinking. Africa, late, corrupt, chaotic. But flip the script. Europe was desperate, running out of wood, coal, and mercy. Africa was abundant, overflowing, and targeted. Europe used oil to rise. Africa's oil was used to keep Africa on its knees. They built empires with your energy, then told you to be grateful for the roads they laid to your own extraction sites. And while you were busy surviving, they were busy editing history, editing memory, editing out the names of black men and women who dared to sit at the oil table and say, we're not just labor, we're owners. Those are the black oil barons they erased, the ones who understood the game early, the ones who saw that oil wasn't just fuel, it was leverage, it was power, it was a seat at the world's rigged poker table. We're bringing them back, one story at a time, because if Europe can celebrate thieves as pioneers, Africa can damn sure celebrate protectors as visionaries. Stay tuned. Next, we start calling names, country by country, well by well, deal by dirty deal, and we'll see who really struck first. Europe loves to act like it discovered everything, like history ain't start till a white man wrote it down. They talk about Texas like it's holy ground, Saudi like it's the first flame, but long before their cowboy hats and desert pipelines, Africans were already pulling black thunder from the earth. Listen close. While Europe was choking on coal dust, Africa was sitting on oceans of buried midnight. They had muskets. We had minerals. They had maps. We had miles of untouched veins. They had ships. We had shores. They wouldn't stop circling. They came with Bibles in the left hand, ledgers in the right. Civilization, they called it. Salvation, they preached. But what they really brought was contracts dipped in poison and flags sharp enough to cut a continent into pieces. They tell you oil history starts in Pennsylvania. They whisper about Rockefeller like he's Moses of the modern age, but they never tell you about the African chiefs who watched strange men test the soil, smell the earth, smirk quietly when the ground told them the truth. There's power here, enough to light up empires, enough to move armies without marching, enough to make men erase whole bloodlines for a barrel. See, Europe didn't just find African oil. They followed it, smelled it, tracked it, the same way a wolf follows blood in the snow. They knew those dark pools under African feet could rewrite the scoreboard of the world. So they moved quick. Before Africa could build refineries, they built regimes. Before Africa could build pipelines, they built puppets. Before Africa could build wealth, they built wars. On one side, Europe in suits, sipping brandy, drawing borders with steel rulers. On the other, Africa in dust, watching strangers argue over land they never walked barefoot on. Europe had newspapers to crown their barons, industrial giants. Africa had elders whose names never left the village, men who first pointed at the ground and said, "There is something living under here." But whose story did the world believe? The one with printing presses and propaganda, or the one told by a grandfather under a mango tree? They turned African oil into European power, turned African land into European leverage, turned African leaders into obstacles, and when they couldn't buy them, they buried them. That's the part they skip in the textbooks. The black oil barons they erased, the kings, chiefs, and quiet geniuses who saw the black rivers beneath their soil and understood what it meant before the colonizer even learned to pronounce the village name. Europe wrote contracts in English and French. Africa read the land in silence and spirit. Europe came with lawyers. Africa came with lineage. Europe came with concessions. Africa came with, "This belongs to my children's children." But in the end, who ended up on the Forbes lists? Who ended up in the footnotes? They'll show you a white man in a hard hat on some offshore rig, smiling like he birthed the ocean. They won't show you the African worker who knows every sound that well makes, who can tell by the smell of the air if something is about to go wrong. They'll show you European CEOs ringing stock market bells. They won't show you the African land ringing with tremors every time another deal is signed overseas. Because, here's the raw truth. Africa struck oil first in reality. Europe struck oil first in the narrative. And in this world, whoever controls the story controls the spoils. But stories can be rewritten. Records can be dug up. Legends can be restored. And name by name, field by field, we're about to bring those black oil barons back from the shadows they were pushed into. Because they weren't just victims, they were visionaries. And the world is overdue to say their names out loud. Europe loves to act like it lit the first match, like the world was dark till some pale hand found a flame. But let's rewind the tape. Before Texas had a rig, before Saudi had a throne of crude, Africa was already wet with black gold, already standing on oceans of power. They just never told you. Because if you knew the first real oil barons were black, standing on African soil, negotiating, strategizing, organizing, their whole script would crack. Picture this. While Europe was still stumbling out of coal smoke, Africa was sitting on wells that could have rewritten history. They had the land, they had the knowledge, they had the leverage. But Europe had one thing Africa didn't. No shame. Europe came with flags and fake prayers. Africa came with trust and treaties. Europe came with contracts written like traps. Africa came with handshakes and honor. Europe came to extract. Africa came to build. That's the contrast. That's the crime. They'll tell you about Rockefeller. They'll praise the Rothschilds. They'll write essays about Dutch this and British that. But they go quiet when you ask about the African chiefs who control the coasts where the first drums of crude were moved in the shadows. They go silent when you mention the local kings who tried to renegotiate, who said, "If this oil comes from our mother's belly, then my people will eat first." Those are the men they buried in footnotes. Those are the women they erased from the story, because Europe doesn't mind Africa as a well. It just fears Africa as a shareholder. They'll tell you about Rockefeller. They'll praise the Rothschilds. They'll write essays about Dutch this and British that. But they go quiet when you ask about the African chiefs who controlled the coasts where the first drums of crude were moved in the shadows. They go silent when you mention the local kings who tried to renegotiate, who said, "If this oil comes from our mother's belly, then my people will eat first." Those are the men they buried in footnotes. Those are the women they erased from the story, because Europe doesn't mind Africa as a well. It just fears Africa as a shareholder. Understand this. Europe built empires off African oil before Africa could even build a refinery in peace. They burned our crude in their ships, lit their cities with our darkness, powered their factories with our buried sunlight. But in their movies, Africa is always the backdrop, never the boardroom. In their textbooks, Africa is the resource, never the owner. In their news, Africa is instability, corruption, conflict, but never strategy, negotiation, early adopter of energy wealth. They turned our first mover advantage into a permanent disadvantage by design. That's not history, that's a heist. Europe drew borders with rulers. Africa drew communities with rivers. Europe saw oil as a weapon. Africa saw it as a blessing. Europe brought soldiers and surveyors. Africa brought elders and interpreters. One side came to dominate. The other came to coexist. And in that clash of intentions, the black oil barons and the real first ones got sidelined, sabotaged, or straight up erased. Not because they were weak, but because they were strong enough to threaten the whole European fantasy of being the first and the only. Let's be clear. Before Europe bragged about North Sea oil, it was tapping African wells in the dark. Before America flexed with Texas and Standard Oil, it studied how to move, measure, and monetize what they'd already been siphoning from African ground. Africa was the prototype. Europe was the plagiarism. Africa was the original source. Europe was the remix with better PR. They turned our first discoveries into their first dividends. They turned our early partnerships into their permanent control, and then had the nerve to call us late to development. The audacity. So when they tell you oil made the Middle East, remember, oil could have remade Africa first. When they say energy built Europe, remember, Africa's energy built Europe too. They just stamp their name on our receipts. When they teach you about OPEC, remember the unspoken prequel, the African wells, the African deals, the African resistance that never made the documentaries. Because you can't talk global oil without Africa's shadow in the room. You can't map energy history without black fingerprints on the blueprint. They know that. They just hope you don't. This isn't nostalgia. This is a warning, because the same playbook is back on the table. Oil, gas, cobalt, lithium, new names, same game. Europe still comes with the suit and the smile. Africa still holds the ground and the future. But this time, the story doesn't have to end with our barons buried and their barons crowned. This time, we say the names. We study the contracts. We remember who struck oil first. And we make sure no one ever again turns black discovery into whitewashed history. Africa wasn't late. Africa was first. They just erased the credits. Now we're rolling them back. Europe likes to act like it woke the world up. But Africa? Africa was already wide awake, counting stars and drilling dreams, while Europe was still arguing about who owned the moonlight. They tell you the story like this. Oil is a Western miracle. Texas cowboys, Arab sheikhs, British rigs. American refineries. They roll the same movie on repeat. White, hard hats, steel towers, flares in the sky, money raining like confetti. But that's not the director's cut. That's the edited version, the colonizer's cut. Because before Europe even finished sharpening its knives, Africa had already struck black gold. Before they brought their flags, their Bibles, their fake treaties, our soil was leaking secrets. Our rivers were whispering wealth. Our swamps were humming with fuel beneath the mud. They didn't discover oil in Africa. They discovered a way to steal the credits. See, in Europe, oil became a crown. In Africa, oil became a crime scene. In Europe, they built fortunes. In Africa, they built excuses. In Europe, the oil man is a tycoon. In Africa, the oil man is a problem. In Europe, he's on the cover of Forbes. In Africa, he's on a watch list. You notice the pattern yet? When oil sits under European soil, it's called national interest. When oil sits under African soil, it's called instability. When Europe drills, it's development. When Africa drills, it's corruption. They write articles about African mismanagement while their companies sign the contracts, rig the numbers, ship the barrels, and wire the profits back to cold cities with warm banks. They turned our oil into their pension plans, turned our wells into their wealth, turned our silence into their strategy. And to make it work, they had to erase the black oil barons, the real ones, the early ones, the ones who knew the land like a heartbeat, the ones who could smell crude in the wind before a single seismic study, before a single foreign flag touched the shore, men and women who dared to say, "This is ours, not leased, not borrowed, ours." Europe looked at them and didn't see partners. They saw problems, obstacles, people who would ask for too much of their own. So they buried them in paperwork, buried them in coups, buried them in sanctions, buried them in headlines that painted them as greedy, unstable, dangerous. They didn't just erase people, they erased possibilities. Because imagine if Africa's first oil stayed in African hands. Imagine Lagos with Dubai's skyline and none of the begging bowls. Imagine Port Harcourt cleaner than Paris, with refineries that actually work for the people, not against them. Imagine Angolan kids flying drones. They built themselves to survey their own oil fields while the world pays them to learn. That's the future they were scared of, so they flipped the script. In Europe, oil financed schools, roads, welfare, power grids. In Africa, oil financed mercenaries, puppets, and palaces for the chosen few. In Europe, oil wrote symphonies of progress. In Africa, they tried to make oil sound like a curse. But here's the part they never tell you. The curse was never the oil. The curse was the contract. The curse was the company. The curse was the handshake you never saw between your president and their boardroom. And behind those deals, there were always black voices saying, "Don't sign that. Not like this. Not for that price. Not with that clause." Those were the black oil barons they erased, the ones who did the math and said, "Wait, this doesn't add up." They got labeled radical, unreasonable, hard to work with. Translation, they refused to be robbed politely. Meanwhile, Europe built its empires on the quiet. London lights, fueled by African shadows, European highways paved with African silence. Those winter heaters that keep their fingers warm enough to write think pieces about African failure. Run on the same oil they told you was your downfall. Contrast is simple. They take our resources and call it trade. We ask for fair terms and they call it a threat. They show you their billionaires as proof of their genius. They hide our buried barons as proof of our chaos. But history is not a courtroom where only one side gets to talk. This is a retrial. New evidence, new witnesses. Africa was first. Not just in time, but in vision. We saw the value. They saw the vulnerability. We saw a chance to build nations. They saw a chance to build navies. We saw oil as a tool. They turned it into a leash. And now, As the world starts whispering about transition and green energy, they're trying to slip out the back door with the last of the loot, acting like the age of oil was a shared story, a joint mistake, a global misunderstanding. No, it was a targeted operation, and Africa was the primary site. So when we say Africa struck oil first, we're not talking about who drilled the first hole in the ground. We're talking about who paid the first price, who bled first, who was lied to first, who was robbed longest. Europe turned oil into a ladder. Africa was forced to wear it like chains. But chains can be melted, ladders can be flipped, and those names they buried, those black oil barons they erased, we're calling them back to the surface, one story at a time, one receipt at a time, one continent waking up and saying, run the credits again from the top. This time, put Africa where it belongs, not in the footnotes, but in the headline. Because the truth is simple, they built an oil empire, but they built it on African ground. And what's rooted in Africa will answer to Africa sooner or later. We're done playing extras in our own movie. Next scene, we step behind the camera, we own the studio, we fund the film, and the world will finally see the black oil barons they tried to erase standing in full color, unapologetic, undeniable, and very much alive in the next generation. Because let's set the record straight. Europe didn't discover oil. Europe discovered the plug. They showed up late to a party we'd already been hosting for centuries. While they were still burning whale fat and praying to coal, Africans were already reading the earth like scripture, listening to the ground bubble, watching the rivers shine strange, seeing fire leap from the soil like the ancestors were lighting matches under their feet. They called it mystery. We called it power. But here's how the story got flipped. In Europe, a man in a suit strikes oil. They call him a magnate, a visionary, a captain of industry. In Africa, a man in sandals strikes oil. They call him tribal, superstitious, lucky. Then send the missionaries, the soldiers, and the signatures to erase him from the paperwork. In Europe, they build statues. In Africa, they bury the evidence. They told the world the first oil kings were white men in Texas hats and British lords with polished boots. But if you follow the pipeline backwards, past the propaganda, past the schoolbook lies, past the colonial contracts written in a language our grandmothers never spoke, you end up where? On African soil. Black hands, black minds, black risk, black genius. They'll tell you Nigeria found oil in 1956, as if the land was blind before Shell got off the boat, as if the Ogoni people didn't already know their ground was sitting on liquid lightning. They'll say Ghana is new to the game, Angola emerging, Equatorial Guinea developing. But that's Europe's favorite trick, call you developing while they're developing your resources. Let's talk contrast. In Europe, oil money built universities, banks, railroads, empires. In Africa, oil money built palaces for puppets, prisons for protesters, and pipelines that run straight from our soil to their refineries. In Europe, oil tycoons became legends. In Africa, oil barons became problems. If you were too smart, too organized, too loved by your people, you didn't get a biography. You got buried. Name erased, legacy looted, land signed away with a handshake and a gun in the background. But here's what they never planned for. Memory is a stubborn thing. You can burn the archives, but you can't burn the stories whispered at 2 a.m. when the generator cuts off and the old man on the veranda starts talking. He'll tell you about the brother who knew where the oil sat before the Europeans brought their experts. He'll tell you about the woman who warned the village, this contract is a coffin, and they laughed, then watched the rivers turn black. Europe wrote reports. Africa wrote warnings. Europe drafted agreements. Africa buried sons. They called their theft investment. They called our resistance instability. But look close. Who insured the ships? Who owned the rigs? Who controlled the maps? Who Who drew the borders that sliced one oil field into 3 countries just to keep us arguing while they kept exporting? They played chess. We were never told we were on the board. Still, the truth leaks. Like crude from a cracked pipe, it seeps through the soil of silence. Our first oil barons weren't just men with money. They were interpreters of the earth, negotiators with nature, scientists without lab coats, economists without titles. They knew, if you can power the world, you should never beg from it. Europe built an empire on our energy, then told us we were behind. Behind what? A system designed to keep us pumping wealth out and importing it back with interest? No. The next frames of this film don't worship Europe's skyline. They don't drool over Dubai or bow to Houston. We turn the camera back to the Niger Delta creeks, the Angolan coasts, the Somali basins, the Sudanese sands, where the first black oil barons stood, looked at the horizon, and saw more than survival. They saw ownership. They saw leverage. They saw a future where Africa didn't just fuel the world. Africa built it. That's the part of the story they tried to bury. But we're here, digging it up line by line, image by image, name by name. Europe had the PR. Africa had the power. And now, for the first time on screen, we're about to show what happens when the power gets its own PR.